Okay, this is portrait01.jpg, and if we're looking at workflows, then obviously portraiture is going to be a big one. Now, there's plenty of entire courses devoted to portrait retouching, portrait enhancing, and so I'll be giving you a general overview of the process. But one thing I want to make clear right from the start is about how appropriate various techniques are for the subject matter. Take this photo for example. This is a stock image from Pixabay. It's not a carefully controlled studio shot of some supermodel who's then been made up out of all recognition. Don't get me wrong, this is a very pretty woman, but it looks like it was taken with a window on the left-hand side, which is often a very good way to take a photo because effectively, if there's no direct light coming in from the window, you end up with something like a huge diffuse light softbox, so you get lots of nice shadows, like you've got here. Now, the photographer, it looks like they were using a pretty good camera with quite an expensive lens, and they know what they're doing. They've set the focal range to something very short here, so the eyes are in focus, but if you look, the tip of the nose and the ears, they're not in focus. It looks like the photographer just said, okay, we're by a window, let's just take a photograph. She hasn't had a whole load of makeup applied, she just looked at the camera and the shot was taken. And so the point I'm trying to make is this is a natural shot. If you start trying to apply a whole load of techniques which were designed for some 12-year-old supermodel in a photo studio, you can end up with an almost too perfect look to the picture that doesn't quite match the kind of picture it is. And so what I want to do with this picture is I want to enhance the photo, and I'll use some of the techniques that a professional retoucher will use, but I'm not going to try and create perfection here. I just want to enhance what's already there. Right, let's get started. Well, the first thing is, as usual, I want to duplicate my layer, and I'm going to call this Fix. So if I do any work directly on a pixel layer, I can do it on the fixed layer. And if I mess up, which I sometimes do, I also have my background layer just as insurance sitting there for me to duplicate again. Okay, so the first thing I would do with this is just look at the picture, and I'll probably start off with a problem-based approach where I identify the biggest problems, the next biggest problems, and so on and so forth. But at some point, I will probably mix in the what do I like about the photo and try and enhance the good points. I'll see how I get on. But for now, what's the biggest problem? Well, there's not too many problems with this. It's already quite a nice photo. So I will say, let's work on the small blemishes in the skin. I'm seeing some pores around the cheekbone areas I can work on. I can see one or two tiny little spots and maybe one or two little smudges of mascara as well. So I will start off with the pores first. Now we will be using frequency separation for this. But if you are using frequency separation, before you work on the finer details, I want you to work on the broader details. So I will create a new layer. I will call this blemishes. Then I will come over to my inpainting brush tool. I've got various blemish removal tools here, but my default one is the inpainting brush tool. It's quite straightforward. And I'm going to come up to my top bar. At the moment it's set to current layer. That means it's going to pick up pixels to stamp down and try and correct things from the current layer. I don't want that. I want current layer and below. And what that means is, let's zoom in on, say, this area here. Come back and reselect my inpainting brush tool, current layer and below is selected. It means that if, for example, I make my brush size a little bit smaller and I find a little blemish here and paint on it, it means any pixels I select to stamp down and hide that little blemish will be selected from this layer or the layer below. Now the layer below is the one that contains the pixels. And so what does that mean? Well, I'll show you. If I make the two underlying layers invisible, my blemishes layer, that's where my pixel is. That's where my new pixels are. And if I make both the layers underneath visible again and make my blemish layer invisible, can you see just around this point here, visible, invisible, visible again. All my little blemish removal splodges are all stored on the layer called blemishes. The pixel layer underneath isn't affected, so it's non-destructive image editing. All right, now let's make a start with this. You want your brush head to be as small as possible. Like I've got a little black head here, and just do that. You want your brush head to be, you can be even smaller than that, as small as, and just drag around and just take out the various different blackheads, blotches, pimples, the kind of thing that people look in the mirror and think, well, shall I squeeze that? Or shall I put a bit of makeup to hide that temporary blotch? Those are the kind of things you want to get rid of. Now, a professional retoucher will spend a lot of time going through all these tiny little, there's a tiny little white head there, another one there. They will go through either using something like an in-painting brush tool, or they might use dodge and burn techniques to go through with a fine tooth comb and try and cover up every little blemish they can get their hands on. For example, they might come up to these points here, these tiny little whiteheads, and start going through them all one by one. We're not going to do that. It will take too long. Instead, we will use frequency separation for this. But there is one thing I want to do. Let's come to Control or Command plus 0 to fit my picture on screen. And I'm going to come to my adjustment layers, and I'm going to add a curves layer. It's sitting on top of everything. And I am going to really exaggerate the darks and light in this picture. And you see what happens when I do that? I'll make it invisible for a second. Because I've really enhanced the contrast of this picture, I'm making what were tiny little blemishes stick out like a sore thumb. Now I'm concentrating on this cheek area where I was working earlier. And if I come and I zoom in, now can you see there are certain areas like here, here, here. If I make my curves layer invisible again, you can see they're not quite as apparent when the look of the picture isn't quite as extreme. So this is just a temporary curves adjustment layer to try and make it obvious the various different blemishes that I need to remove. So come back to my in-painting brush tool, make sure I come back to my blemishes layer. Current layer and below is still selected, so now it makes it much more easy to see where I should be fixing the various different blemishes. I can even make this even smaller, like this. But generally speaking, I'm looking to remove the larger blemishes, and that includes, you may not even be able to see this stuff at the side. I can see some out of focus raised areas here, which are quite large but subtle. I want to get rid of those as well. Because the frequency separation, when I come to do that, I'm going to set a certain amount of blur on one of the two layers that I'll be working on. And if I have any large blemishes in my picture, I might be tempted to set my blur a little bit too high to get the result I want. So this is why I remove the larger blemishes first, so that I can tackle the finer blemishes, like this area of skin, where you can see the skin texture, and manually remove the larger details. Now I might fade out and fade in with this, because this could take a bit of time. Oh, yeah, bits up here. Get rid of those. Fairly large but subtle bit here. Get rid of that. Keep on going. Oh, bit of mascara here. What do you know? I didn't fade out in the end. Now when I come to this bit, I'm going to come back to my curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to retweak my curve so I can bring out the detail in this area here. That's the way you do it. This curves layer is a helper layer. It's not there to affect the final look of the picture. It's just there to pull out various details which I may or may not want to get rid of. Oh, I was about to put a mark down there on my curves adjustment layer. I don't want to do that. Make sure I come back to my blemishes layer and carry on. Just very quickly down here, I've noticed a scar down here, just a slight one, so I'll do that in pieces. I'll try not to do it all in one go. And also, because it was a pretty good lens that took the photo, you can just see one or two fine hairs just on the bottom of the lip. That is very common. I'm sure everyone has that, although occasionally they will ask models to shave just before a photo shoot. And so for stuff like this, again, you will occasionally see professional retouchers using, say, a burn technique just to try and paint out those one or two areas. One thing they will do though, if they're using blemish removal, is they will make that brush incredibly small and take out the hairs one by one. There's a reason some people do this for a living, because it can be a very professional job, and you're getting the techniques here. Look, I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to make my brush size a bit bigger and just do one fell swoop like this. I am using a mouse here because I can't assume that you have a tablet and pen. Left to my own devices, I might use my pen to do this. Anything down here? I'm finding, because I'm zoomed in so close now, I'm getting too close to the picture. I'm finding it difficult to decide what needs adjusting and what doesn't need adjusting. So I will press Control or Command plus 0 to zoom out a little bit, and yeah, now I've got a clear idea of what I should be tackling. I'll make my brush size a bit smaller. And it's these large, slightly out of focus areas, those are the bits that I want to tackle, just around the forehead. Plus 1 or 2 bits around here. Now I'm just scanning around in general to see if there's anything which leaps out at me. And I keep on discovering just slight marks on the face. And this could take quite a bit of time, but I do want to move on. Let's just take a look at what we've done. Okay, so our blemishes layer, that's with it invisible, and that's with the blemishes layer reapplied.